Okay, so yeah, so today's Q&A is with Susan Wolf. She's the distinguished professor, the Edna J. Koury Professor of Philosophy at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. And she's the author of the book Meaning in Life and Why It Matters. So we've spoken with similar guests before, such as John Vervaeke, who thinks that Susan's book is the best discussion on this topic. So I'm really looking forward to the conversation. And just to sort of get things started, I was wondering, could you sort of start by let's maybe ask what is meaning in life and why does it matter?
Okay, good question. So as we were talking kind of before the opening, there are two things I want to say. The first is just to emphasize that meaning in life is a dimension of a good life. We want our lives to have meaning, to be meaningful, and that it should not be understood as synonymous with or a subset of what we ordinarily mean by happiness in life, a pleasant, pleasing or enjoyable lives are not to be identified with meaningful lives, even though there's a lot of overlap, and meaning often gives one pleasure and joy and felt satisfaction. It's also true that you could live a life that was enjoyable and yet feel like it lacked meaning. And I think you can live a life that's meaningful, that even though it is rewarding in a certain way, you wouldn't describe as enjoyable, because what gives meaning to your life could be very hard, could be stressful, could involve a vulnerability to pain. So the first thing I want to say is meaning is something different from happiness and pleasure, and it's also different from morality. Maybe we'll get to that more later. And then the question is, well, what is it then? And after a lot of sort of working through other people's ideas, the conclusion I come up with, the proposal I make is, I express it first in a slogan, namely, meaning arises when subjective attraction meets objective attractiveness. And to put that into maybe plainer language, my thought is that meaning is a function of loving something worthy of love and being able to actively do something affirmative with that, right? Creating, preserving, sharing, appreciating, whatever it is that you love. And it could be a person, it could be an activity, it can be a kind of realm, maybe music is a realm of activity. So in a nutshell, those are my views.
Yeah, lovely. Does anyone have any burning questions straight away? If you're on Zoom, maybe if you type your questions in the chat, this kind of thing. But yeah, so we're all musicians here. I was wondering, because obviously with music we're dealing with aesthetics and beauty and this kind of thing. So is it, in these categories of trying to understand what meaning is meaning an aesthetic experience?
Gosh. Well, the term aesthetic experience is itself a pretty vague one, hard to put a clear definition on. I wouldn't have said that it's an aesthetic experience necessarily, but I do think aesthetic value is the kind of value that engaging with can give meaning to your life. So I'd rather, I think a life pursuing aesthetic value, again, creating it, preserving it, sharing it, it is certainly one kind of meaningful life. I'm not a musician myself, but I do think of artists as prime examples of of ways to live meaningfully.
Do you have a question?
Yeah, if hello, it was a very beautiful definition. I've never heard it put that succinctly before, but that also gives rise to a few questions. If meaning is distinct from pleasure, with considerable overlap, but can also be distinct from each other, then why would we want to find it, or could you make a case for searching for it? Because if we can feel good and bad things, we just search for good. Then if meaning may not have any role to play in it sometimes, right? So why would we want to search for meaning?
Yeah, a great question. And I guess I want to start by saying, if you don't care about meaning, I'm not trying to impose it as an obligation. But I think most of us do care about meaning. So one way to think about it is meaning is connected, I think, closely with living in a way you can be proud of. That to live meaningfully is to live in a way that you can be proud of, so that you think, so that you don't feel like you're wasting your life. You don't feel like a third person's perspective on your life would be either disgusted or uninterested in it. And so that's one way of explaining what we get out of living in a way that is engaged with some value outside of ourselves that we think of as kind of objective. And as I said, it's possible to not care, to not care about being proud of yourself. It's imaginable, but I think most of us do have that drive. If you stand back and reflect. When I said earlier that you could live maybe a happy life that wasn't meaningful, usually that would come from a life that doesn't reflect on, what am I doing with my life, and how can I justify my life to someone else? To say, well, I'm traveling and enjoying the sights, and I'm, eating, delicious food, and that can make you happy until you start thinking, well, is this enough, or do I need, or what is someone else going to think of me? So I guess that's you're right. So it's really this idea of sort of step back and reflect on your life, and if it's not meaningful, you'll feel bad about it.
Yeah, I do agree with you, because I don't think I've come across anybody who doesn't search for some meaning at some point in their life, and people who never search for it also reflect on how empty their lives have been. It's a very common experience. So then the follow-up question would be that why do we need meaning so much? Why does everybody seek it out? Is it something societally conditioned, or is it something more innate and more biological, their evolutionary drive towards finding meaning? Do you have a commentary on this?
It's a good question. I don't know. I do think an interest in meaning, or at least interpreting meaning the way I do, is to some extent a function of culture. Maybe the very question I'm asking is reflective of an individualism, that I need my life to mean something separate from a community. But actually, I should also say that I think a lot of people, maybe most of us, or most people, live meaningful lives without ever trying to. They don't seek meaning. They find things they love, and they engage in them. They find people they love, and if those relationships go well, or if the activities that you love go well, you might not ever have to think, well, what am I doing with my life? It doesn't come up, because there's nothing to question it or shake you up. And that's fine. I don't think it's actually essential that you look for meaning. What I think is important is that you get meaning. And as I say, for some people, it doesn't require thinking about it. Before the recording started, I mentioned as one of the things that kind of led me to start writing about meaning, the fact that when I was teaching at a university a long time ago, I felt that the students were going on paths for a kind of socially recognized success, making a lot of money, doing things that were hard. They were doing it very well. But they weren't asking themselves, is this something that I love? Nor were they asking themselves, is this something that I believe is worthwhile? They were, I mean, conventionally, no one would question it, say, oh, of course you should, you make a lot of money, that's worthwhile. But I felt they were not actually, they were in danger of what you just mentioned. You wake up one day and you say, why am I spending all my time doing this? And that, putting meaning, the concept of meaning or the dimension of meaning more in the forefront of people's consciousness, making it a more salient thing, would be helpful to ward off the danger of going following a kind of socially encouraged path that was leading you away from meaning. That said, as I said, I think a lot of people's lives are meaningful without their even ever trying it to make it so.
Keith has asked a really good question in the chat. So in your book, you talk about meaning as subjective attraction to something that's objectively attractive. So how can we ground this objective part of meaningfulness? What is it that we can say is objective about meaning?
Yes, well, good question, Keith. Kind of the $1 million question that I kind of expect all the time, but and my answer might be disappointing, though it might actually, or might seem like I'm trying to wheedle my way out of it. But my answer is that when I talk about objective value, objective attractiveness, I don't mean to make any grand metaphysical claims about, there's value out there in the universe, whether we know about it or not. I want to emphasize the fact that we can be wrong about what's valuable. It's something that can't be true if it's totally subjective. I mean, so there's, one very popular view, maybe it was even more popular when I started writing than it is now, but it's still popular, is, whatever you find meaningful is meaningful for you. Suggesting that you can't be wrong. Like if you find meaning in playing video games, then playing video games is meaningful. If you find meaning in running marathons, then running marathons is meaningful. If you find meaning in doing analytic philosophy, then analytic philosophy is meaningful. That would be a subjective view. Against that, I want to say, well, maybe so and maybe not. And when you step back and think, well, just because I find it meaningful, that doesn't make it so. Even though all the things I just said might be meaningful, in fact, you can imagine someone, not just imagine, someone being in some way deluded about, it feels valuable at the time, and then even as we were talking earlier, you wake up one day and you say, what was I thinking? This was just not, I was going off in a weird direction. So, some kinds of examples that might encourage that are, in the one direction, someone who's seduced by a cult or by a cult figure and thinks, this is a person worth devoting my life to and giving my savings to, and then it turns out actually that was all a big mistake, and you've in some sense perhaps wasted those years, those resources. You've gone in on the wrong track and you got to get back. More controversial examples could be someone who goes after the big bucks as a corporate lawyer and, works, 18 hours a day, sacrificing family relationships and everything else. And then says, I am defending or making money for these people who are destroying the environment and cheating their customers. This is not a meaningful thing to do, even though I think there's actually a common experience of people who go into law, work for a big firm. Like, again, they're aiming for partnership and so on. And then one day they have a kind of awakening where they think, this is actually not something that I believe is worth devoting my life. So that kind of example is meant as an illustration of the idea that what's valuable, what's worth loving and devoting aspects of your life to isn't necessarily what feels valuable at a given moment in time. It's not subjective, therefore it's non-subjective, and objective is the most obvious word to use for that. But to get a theory of objective value is to ask for something I don't have an answer to. All I have is some pretty commonsensical thoughts about how you go about thinking about whether what you're doing is valuable. Something that, by the way, applies very well to someone who spends a lot of their time doing philosophy. That can also feel, it feels wonderful, but then you step back and you think, really? What, am I really doing any good for anyone? Am I even, doing any good for myself? So, I think it's useful to ask those questions. And when you answer, I think the way to try to make progress is, first of all, to ask those questions, to try to articulate what it is that you find, if you can, worthwhile, to talk to other people about what they find worthwhile, about what they think about what you're doing. As I say, this is kind of common sense, but I think that's the right way to go with these big questions about objective value.
Did you have another question?
Yeah, based on what you just said, was that there are certain things that people might find meaningful in the moment, but then soon it dissolves into nothingness, or maybe it changes, right? But you also did mention at an earlier point that some people just find things that are meaningful, and without having to search too far, live meaningful lives. So is there a hierarchy or an organizing principle that can say that these things are inherently going to be more lastingly meaningful than the others? Is there a principle that at work here that can identify it? Some things could be common sense, like something that you're trying to do musical, learn an instrument would be more meaningful than, to the majority of people, than something else, like, I don't know. I don't want to compare. Maybe it might be too controversial. But there is a certain organizing principle in certain things being more lastingly meaningful. To my sense, is there one in your case? Do you think there's a way to organize things that's more meaningful than others?
Frankly, I'm not tempted to offer organizing principles. I think a lot of it, there's a lot of juggling about, what makes something meaningful. As I mentioned, my general view is that what you need is to love something worthy of love and be able to engage with it. So there are at least two obvious aspects to what makes something contribute more to meaning. One is how much you love it, and the other is how worth loving it is, right? And so the first thing to say is, look, to live meaningfully is to find something worthwhile enough that you love enough. Not just one thing. Most of our lives have multiple sources of meaning and contributions, but I don't think there's any reason to say, well, I need to find the most valuable thing that I care about and put all of my energy into it. I'm not a musician. I'm a little bit nervous about coming up with an example like this, but so let me use a philosophy example, and you can do the analogy on your own. Not all philosophy is a study of some other, greater philosopher, but some of it is. Some people, specialize in Kant, some in Aristotle, some in Plato. All right. And some philosophers are better than others, right? So arguably, Kant and Aristotle are two of my favorites, but arguably those are like among the most, best Western philosophers in the history of civilization. Then there are other philosophers that are good, but not as important as, right. So I don't know, Shaftesbury is just an example of I don't know very much about Shaftesbury, but he's a philosopher people study sometimes, and he's good. And now you could think, well, if you want your life to be as meaningful as possible, you should study Kant rather than Shaftesbury, because Kant is a more amazing philosopher than Shaftesbury. But I don't actually think that is a sensible way to go about figuring out what to do. I think you look at what moves you. You look at what you love, and what you feel like you have something to contribute to. It might be Kant, but it might be Shaftesbury. And a person who, there are Shaftesbury scholars or people whose thoughts are kind of government, and they're doing, wonderful work. And so I'm not inclined to kind of put a hierarchy in terms of that. Right? You could take a different kind of example, a little bit harder to argue about, I suppose. But you could say, well, on the one hand, I could be a musician. On the other hand, I could be a surgeon. And if I'm a surgeon, I can save people's lives. Whereas if I'm a musician, well, you know what you do with me. And so you might think, well, I should, if I can be a surgeon. But I don't think that's true. I mean, you want some people to be surgeons, right? You want some people to be surgeons, but you don't want everyone to be surgeons. And music is a wonderful thing. And if you love music, and if you have something to contribute to the world of music, or the world that contains music, that's a great thing to do. And so, again, I'm not really, I would say, don't look for a hierarchy. Right? Look, start with loving things. Then say, is this worth it?
Yeah, I'm not looking for a hierarchy or an organizing principle to start conflicts, rather. Because I do agree, comparing surgery and medicine and music may not be quite a fair comparison to either fields, right? So I'm happy to give you that. But we are talking about both these fields in some way are exalted, in a manner of speaking, as compared to some other things. So, I mean, you talked about difference between one incredibly famous philosopher and one slightly well-known philosopher, slightly less well-known philosopher, but you're still in the realm of philosophy, which is already quite an exalted field with a lot of effort that it demands. So, but you can compare Kant to, I don't know if you know Rebecca Black, who wrote the song Friday. It's a good time on Friday for 4 minutes, right? And
write it down.
If you listen to the song for 4 minutes, it doesn't get more substantial than that, what the point is said, right? So I would say inherently one is in some manner of speaking more meaningful than the other. There will be a fringe population that denies it, but so the reason I wanted this organizing principle is because there is a danger of finding something meaningful in the moment only to later discover that it wasn't so, right? So, and that is a certain degree of danger when we are searching for something meaningful. So I was thinking, if there was an organizing principle or a hierarchy or some guiding principle, it would enable us to find things that are more rewardingly meaningful than things that are less so, and because the time is finite and life is finite and the effort is limited, and therefore, so that's the reason I asked it, rather than, I don't want to say, oh, medicine is better or music is better, none of that, but rather this way.
Right, I get that. Well, I mean, right. I mean, you're absolutely right. There is, it's risky. I mean, there's a risk that you will find something meaningful and and later regret that you spent whatever time you did. Right. But to me, the only way to, there's a risk if you did come up with a principle, there's a risk that would stifle creativity or innovation, like you say, because it doesn't fit the principle. And I think among the most meaningful things in a person's life can be, forging a new direction that hasn't been thought of, and it might not get a lot of external support at first either. One of the examples probably everybody thinks of are, like Van Gogh, who nobody, no one paid attention to his work. And so or Van Gogh, maybe you say anyway. You think, no, you've got to, so there's something important about not looking for some external or universal principle to tell you what to do. To me, again, the only thing I can think of as a way of kind of mitigating the riskiness that you're devoting your life or a piece of your life to something worthless is to just be somewhat self-conscious about the question. Is there worth here? Can I see worth? Can I articulate it? And if not, then you can start worrying about it. And but if you just feel like, no, I'm looking, I'm reflecting, I'm remembering to think about meaning, and it still feels good, then then you just have to run with it, I think.
Mm-hmm. Keith, do you have another question? Can you unmute? Is there a...
Let's see. Testing.
Yeah.
Brilliant.
Yeah, I was just reflecting on, I liked the part of your answer which emphasized common sense. And since you mentioned Aristotle, I was wondering whether one way to ground this, because it seemed to me that worthy was doing the same kind of explanatory work as objective. So worthy of being attracted to is a similar kind of construct. And I wondered whether it might help to ground this in virtue ethics. So the cultivation of the virtues in balance or phronesis might promote human flourishing. And then if we get into the definitions of human flourishing, I'm kind of the view, rather like all the arguments in metaethics, that just kind of are always a draw. It's because it's very, very difficult to ground morality without just saying, well, you have to pick a side. And then certain things follow in self-consistent ways. So you can, on the other side of the divide, come up with organizing principles to say, well, this intersubjectively does in fact produce human flourishing more likely in most contexts than just beating people over the head from an early age. Letting them have education, letting them have freedom of expression, letting them pursue what they want to become engaged in and become attracted to is probably a better bet for human flourishing. But that's only if I've already picked a side to say, this is my vision of what human flourishing entails. It won't be shared necessarily by the Chinese Communist Party, who might have a very different view. And just to speak to the becoming really engaged with something in the moment and then subsequently deciding that perhaps wasn't very meaningful. I just wonder whether you could actually expand that in terms of perspective and make it much worse and say that entire civilizations for millennia have in fact engaged in practices which they considered deeply meaningful, only for future generations to go, what were they thinking? Why did they do that? Yeah, that's kind of what I was musing.
Right. Well, so there was a lot in what you said. I'm not sure if there's a specific question or comment I should reply to. I should say, I guess I feel like my thoughts about meaning are, I take an Aristotelian outlook on kind of the good life all the way through. So in some way, I feel like, yes, I take all of this to be connected in some way to an Aristotelian perspective, whatever that means. I don't know if it's grounded in virtue ethics. I don't know. And I guess I don't think living virtuously is the same as living meaningfully. So I don't know that that's something you had in mind or not. I mean, I'm all in favor of living virtuously. And I do think working at living virtuously and is a meaningful endeavor. But I think there are lots of meaningful lives of people who are not very virtuous and not very morally good, according to any moral theory. So again, artists, there are a lot of artists that you can that seem to me to be examples of that, who, when you find out, you read their biographies, you think they were pretty self-centered people, they were pretty nasty people, but they did great things, and they and I mean, so morality isn't the same, and virtue isn't the same as meaning. I think their lives were meaningful, even if they weren't admirable in other ways. Or so I don't want to confuse them, but I do think that there's some. But I also want to agree that freedom and education and the ability to explore and find what's worthwhile is the best. I mean, socially, that's the best way to get a world in which people can live meaningful lives.
I guess I'm drawing the parallel with morality because of this parallel difficulty in metaethics of grounding objective value and objective morality is the same. It seems to me parallel. Certainly, I think we can imagine without contradiction that you could cultivate a subset of the virtues, like curiosity, and in balance, so that it's with rigor. So the phronesis would be about balancing the default mode network, if you like, in terms of creativity, and the executive control in terms of editing what you've done to make it then meaningful. But be seriously morally deficient at the same time. So I agree, meaning and morality are not the same, but that leads us still with that problem. Yes, it might appeal to our intuitions that it's great and meaningful to help the environment or to help other people, but that leads into the same justification problem. One final thing, that it is the case that $5 is worth $5, even if it's just a piece of paper and its trajectory entirely depends on what everyone thinks about it. So there is a middle ground between, so there's the difference between that Searle made between ontologically objective and epistemologically objective. That might be a useful way to think of it. I don't know.
Well, that's connected to my thought that you can be wrong, right? Right? I mean, it can both seem true, it can seem well argued and right, and it can still be wrong. So there's that gap. There also something I didn't comment on in your earlier comments, which having to do with the relationship between intersubjective and subjective and objective. For better, for worse, I don't want to identify worth or objective value with intersubjective value, because though I wouldn't say whole societies have been wholly, directed towards something non-worthwhile. Whole societies, including my own, have had, have all believed something that we later come to see as just completely false. And so I don't think the fact that everybody in your community or society thinks this is good makes it good any more than the fact that you think it's good makes it good. I mean, if it's good because there are reasons to support it, or because it yields a certain kind of experience or result. But I don't have a theory. And I guess with you, I mean, I agree. These are the same, meta ethics as a discipline out to look for objective value is fraught with problems. And I'm really trying to avoid that by my appeal to common sense. Right. So I think we're on the same page here.
Yeah, definitely. That was my favorite thing about the answer is that, well, it's common sense. It makes sense. Absolutely.
Just to sort of comment on this as a musician, so obviously we're all musicians, and some of us like thinking about philosophy, but maybe most of us are coming from that musical perspective. I think something we were talking about with another one of our guests, Yosha Bark, who does a lot of AI stuff, is he says what exists maybe to defend something objective is that there are networks of care. People care in just to sort of draw on something from your book. One of the commentaries was from Jonathan Haidt, who said one of the things that will make the argument stronger is an understanding of hive psychology, that people care about things in groups together. So maybe if we're thinking about something that is objective as a way to defend something that this is meaningful, maybe we could have a think about this as something that is to do with the way that our psychology works and the way that our brains work as musicians. Maybe something an example to think about is playing in an orchestra. Everyone is involved in the same project together. I was just wondering what your thoughts are on this as hive psychology. What do you think?
Well, there are two different branches to your question I want to go into. Hive psychology is not one of my favorite concepts because for reasons that other people have noticed too. I mean, hive psychology is also mob psychology, right? I mean, you can get a group that confirms each other in their values and they're scary values, right? And the fact that human psychology may be highly susceptible to the rewards of being part of a hive, it's very dangerous. So that was not one of my favorite parts of Jonathan Haidt's commentary. One that was, however, one of my favorite parts was so I don't know if everyone read the book or much less the whole book. But one thing he said, which is also connected to psychology, and right this minute I cannot remember the phrase for it, but it had to do with the kind of fertility of an interest. So he gave an example of some student in his class who liked to ride horses, and somehow, as he questioned her, it came out not only she started as a child, she liked horses. She was, obviously was a privileged child. She, was able to ride horses, and but it developed into all kinds of things. So she read a lot of books about horses, fiction and nonfiction. She learned a lot about horses. She learned to take care of horses. She got involved in the community of her stable, and anyway, so it was like this love of horses or of horseback riding kind of grew into a whole world of connections, kind of not hive psychology, but a web of interests that broadened and enriched her life in all sorts of ways. That seemed to me a very profound and useful thing, which I assume is connected also to, an interest in music, or are really, many things can, have this kind of fertile aspect to it. But there's also, and again, I don't like the word hive psychology, but the importance of social, of a social aspect to what you are engaged in, sharing it, teaching it, passing it on, contributing either in live ways to a group of people, or even just in being part of a kind of historical chain, you know, I'm part of the community of musicians who are, you know, kind of together moving the field along, or that seems to me, for most of us, a very, very important part of meaning, and one that kind of helps keep us going. When I asked how you came to know about me in the first place, it occurred to me just yesterday that it might have been something else, which it wasn't, but during COVID, well, I mean, I guess COVID is around forever, but during the time when we were all isolated, there's a musical group that does contemporary music in Vienna, and they you know, they put on concerts, and they and then everyone was socially isolated. You couldn't play with anyone else. You couldn't have live concerts, and they didn't know what to do, and had decided to commission some solo pieces. They commissioned various composers to perform, to compose works for one instrument, and then they had these musicians perform these things, and they put together like a boxed set of these pieces. You're nodding. Do you know about what I'm talking about, actually?
I mean, we over COVID, not the specific one, but there's lots of examples of this kind of thing with lots of groups.
Okay, well, I'll finish up the story, because this is how I thought, oh, maybe this is how you thought. Anyway, they put together this box set of these individuals playing these pieces and some other pieces that had already been composed. And then they invited several writers, including me, to write little pieces on the idea of solo, that they included in the notes that accompanied the volume. And it was a really fun, you know, a really fun invitation, you know, very different from what I usually get. So it was like you know, I don't know how many words, but, you know, maybe 5 pages at most, on the idea of solo. And what I think they actually wanted, and what in any case I did, was to raise this question about whether something could be meaningful that was completely, you know, unrelated to other people. And because this was for a musical collection, you know, the most obvious question was, you know, whether, if you were just you and your instrument, or had no connections to other people, could it be meaningful to do something with it? So that was so I'd written this 5-page piece. I can send it to you, and you can share it with whoever wants. It was fun at the time. But you know, what it was, I mean, I didn't actually answer that question, so I don't have an answer to it, but along the way, I was reflecting on all the different ways in which even something that is superficially a solo in music and in most other fields is really, in the longer view, connected to a community of other people. It's not, you know, it's not like you're you know, on a desert island, you know, never seeing or interacting with other people, or much less with a history and a tradition that's ongoing. So I thought, you know, it's really quite rare for there to be a solo activity that is as literally independent of other people as usual as can be. But I do think, especially to feel meaning, to feel that what you're doing is meaningful, connecting to other people is, for most of us, very important.
Actually, I was going to ask the question of, is meaning possible in a non-social context? Because on several answers you said a part of meaningful life would be what is viewed by the third person as something not wasteful. So right from there till now, a lot of examples of meaning involves either some form of societal conditioning or viewed by others in society. So I was just going to ask, are those then not exclusive at all? They are quite inclusive of each other and almost completely dependent on each other, because is there meaning without the social aspect of human life?
Right. As I said, I don't have a certain answer to that. I think empirically, for most of us, a social aspect is essential to our feeling that what we're doing is worthwhile. But I have two examples that make me say, look, I don't want to make a universal judgment here. I mean, one, I don't know if this counts or not, is, the Van Gogh example. Like no one appreciated what he was doing. No one encouraged him. Well, actually his brother, I guess, did, but largely he was very isolated and had to just, and I don't know of course he also was, I say, of course, he also was very depressed, and but to say, was his life meaningful? Even just, of course it was. I mean, go and spend some time with his paintings, and like, how meaningful can you get? I mean, it's right. I think like to be able to do that is meaningful, but he didn't get the feedback that would have made him also happy with what he was doing. So, so that's one kind of example. A very different kind, which I used in this little piece I wrote, where I was thinking, could there really be something meaningful that really, it was irrelevant whether anyone knew about it, whether anyone cared about it. What I speculated was that, well, if there's any candidate for that, the best candidate I came up with was, I don't know if anyone has seen the film called Free Solo.
Oh, yeah.
So a bunch of you have, right? About a rock climber who does El Capitan. So this idea of like battling the elements in some amazing way, you might think, look, that's that might be meaningful to someone independent of any cultural background or any social connection. So I thought, well, that's at least a candidate, and I can see how that it might be. I do find it meaningful. It's an impressive achievement. It's something I don't think it was worthless, and I can imagine that being something that it really doesn't matter to the guy that was in Free Solo what anyone else thought about it. And as an anecdote, which the person who had commissioned this piece from me, who was, one of the directors of this musical company, he found this. He read the piece before it was published, and he found it really, he really resisted the idea that could be meaningful in a completely, utterly isolated way. And so he actually wrote, not to the guy who's the subject of that film, but to someone else whose name escapes me at the moment, but who was a very famous climber, first descents without oxygen up Everest and stuff like that. And he wrote to him, and he got an answer back, which he sent me. It was in German, so I needed a friend to translate it for me, and I might have missed some of it, but it did. The way I understood the translated answer, it was, I didn't care at all about society or human rights. So it did sound like that was a confirmation that there could be meaningful activity that was utterly independent of social anything.
But taking Free Solo, staying on the subject of Free Solo, there's another question. Sorry, before we change topics, I'll finish up. I wanted to ask a question about Free Solo. Even I've seen the film, and Alex Honnold, the subject of the film, extraordinary man. He really did not care if somebody filmed him or watched him or not. He would have done it either way. But inherent to his journey, what I felt was the overcoming of something that was extraordinarily difficult, right? And that was what was
I
meaning.
agree.
But what was extraordinarily difficult was also defined by the community of climbers in a certain sense. Of course, yes, it could be just one rock, it could be the whole El Capitan, but there was a certain degree of acknowledged difficulty, communally speaking, that this was an impossible or seemingly impossible one. And inherent to that challenge was even if he didn't show it to anybody, even if all he felt was inside him, he knew that it had never been done before. Which was already involving society at large. You know what I mean? In that it was considered difficult by everybody, and he overcame it. Maybe he didn't care about the recognition or the applause quite the same way Van Gogh did, and that's what caused him a great consternation. But even Van Gogh, for example, was a continuation of a line of painting that he knew where his place was in society. He knew his worth because he'd seen people who'd come before him, and he knew it was worthwhile. Just recognition is different to, however, that. And I feel like even in the free solo example, there is a certain sense of community. It's not completely isolated there, no?
Well, so I agree with you about Van Gogh, that look, he is part of the history of art is important to understanding Van Gogh's achievement and so on. I'm not sure I agree with you about Axel. What's his name again? You got his name.
Alex Honnold, yeah.
Right. I'm not sure the difficulty is socially defined when it comes to, is it difficult to climb El Capitan? I don't think you need a community to figure that out. The idea of, if it was important that it was something no one had done before, that's an interesting idea. That I don't know if that was important to him, or if it was just that, like, if I can, I can do this, and I can do, like, give me the hardest thing available and I can do it. It might be that you don't care whether anyone else could do it, just that, you're raising interesting questions about that. But it's kind of a side point because, as I say, empirically, most of us are not built that way, not built to not care about what other people do. And surely, one of the more obvious sources of meaning come from doing something that others recognize and appreciate as valuable, or that actually helps other people, enhances their world in some way. So one doesn't really have to spend too much time thinking about the very idiosyncratic case.
Have you seen The Alpinist? It's another film like the free solo.
Remind me of what that's about. I'm not sure if I've seen it.
The Alpinist, it's a film about one of Alex Honnold's the people that he looks up to.
And I haven't seen it.
Yeah, it's really cool. It's this guy called Marc Andre. I can't remember his last name, but he's this sort of mysterious climber. Unfortunately, he's passed away now, obviously, because of his free soloing. But what he did, not just El Capitan, but he would climb up frozen waterfalls just to like ice picks, and hold himself up with that. So there's that as well. We've got some more questions in the chat, and someone's raised their hand as well, so I will get to them. But so this idea of meaning as something that is connecting to something larger than yourself. Obviously, like these examples of like free solo, like climbing El Capitan without any ropes or any gear. Another way of thinking about this, Samuel says, is the word religion means to connect, to link, religio, to link back to something greater. Samuel asks, what are your thoughts on religious experience as a source of meaning?
Well, certainly religious experience, I'm not sure what to make of that. If that's literally meant to be the feeling of, if it's meant to refer to the kind of qualitative character of an experience, that can be illusory or not. So it's not automatically meaningful, but it will feel meaningful, but it could also be right, based on something delusional. I mean, you can have a religious experience, on psychedelic drugs, which may or may not be something that ultimately you want to say is an experience of something real. That said, religious life and religious activity and involvement in a religious community is often a source of meaning, and is probably, interestingly, the more traditional question of what, is there a meaning of life, seems to almost require a religious answer. Like, there's a meaning of life if God exists and gave us a purpose, and otherwise not, right? I'm kind of veering off from that traditional question to ask, how life can be meaningful, where that's not a question that requires a metaphysical answer of being given a purpose from outside. That said, if there is, if we have been given a purpose outside, and you are in sync with that, that can certainly be a direction for meaning. And even if we haven't, I think a lot of religious communities, or people living in with a religious perspective on life, have very meaningful lives through the lenses of their religious worldview. So I don't, again, it's hard to give a universal answer here, because there are religions and some of them, I talked about cults that are, that you think of as, no, that's actually sending you off in the wrong direction. There's, the history of, religious wars and religious, atrocities is out there. But then there's also, as I say, kind of wonderful stuff that I think has given meaning and value to lots of people's lives.
Lovely. There's someone who's raised their hand. Eduardo, do you want to unmute and ask your question?
Oh, no. I think it was mentioned in the chat already. I was just going to raise something about just on the climbing and the community seeing something as difficult. And I think you also mentioned it already, Susan, is that the task of itself, perhaps overcoming that kind of challenge just yourself, be it if it's a difficult task or not, but just by that overcoming is worthwhile and meaningful within itself, right? So, we probably don't need that kind of validation from an external source anyway, regardless. It was just something that I wanted to follow up, bounce back on that.
Well, thanks. I actually think so. I do find it, at least intuitively, plausible that just overcoming challenges, especially difficult challenges, which is going to be relative to who you are, and what counts as a challenge will depend on, on your abilities, physical, psychological, whatever, and that overcoming them in the direction of something is meaningful. It is, that seems to me intuitively right. So someone with sort of serious physical handicaps, who, for whom, just being able to live independently, being able to, dress themselves, feed themselves, that can be a tremendous achievement and something worth being proud of. But I think it's controversial in, if someone says, well, if someone wants to offer a competing view of what's valuable, I start with intuitions and don't really know, because I don't have a theory of objective value, how to defend that beyond intuitions and communal thinking about that. So I mean, it's a good example of like, is it meaningful, or is it just, look, what they do is admirable but not meaningful? It's hard to say, but it works for me. It's meaningful.
Samuel's also added another comment in the chat, is that people can find meaning and enter sort of like a flow state doing things that are unethical. So it's kind of, I was wondering, another philosopher who sort of separates the ethical and what I was referring to earlier as the aesthetic, as Kierkeggard. He says you can either have either or, either live an ethical life or live this sort of life of aesthetics and all of this idea of well, just to give an example, the RNCM book club recently read the A Clockwork Orange, where you've got this guy who's really obsessed with like Beethoven and beautiful music and this kind of thing, but extremely violent character, and goes out and does horrible things, but is a sort of aesthetic hero. So what happens when all of our views on ethics and all of this kind of stuff gets reduced down to taste, personal taste? It matters to me, this kind of thing. What kind of world gets created out of that? So Sam asks, how do we reconcile the quest of meaning and the good life, of virtue, and this kind of thing?
Good. Good questions. Several questions there, I think. I guess first of all, I would question what's felt for me like a contrast between objective good being identified with moral goodness and aesthetic value as being a matter of taste, where that's supposed to be something subjective. I mean, I think objective or non-subjective. I mean, the objective value in aesthetics as well as in ethics, in the sense that you can be wrong. I mean, you can think this is a great film, and then you see it the second time and you think, no, I way overrated that film, and vice versa. You can something can leave you cold, a piece of music too, obviously, and then you hear it later, or you hear it with having learned something about the piece or the and said, oh, this is great. I just didn't appreciate it before. So I do think it's not taste, aesthetics is taste and ethics is objective. I also do think a person whose life is, full of aesthetic objective value can also do something morally horrible. I don't think these are you can also try to strike a balance. So now the question is, what does this have to do with meaning? And in the book, I'm pretty, I start out early saying meaning is not to be identified with happiness, but it's also not to be identified with morality. So I do think someone's life could be, morally highly objectionable and yet meaningful. That said, meaning is only one dimension of the good life, and ethics is another dimension. And when someone is, morally horrible, the more salient, the fact that they lived a meaningful life should not really be the salient response we have to it. It's like, so people, when I first started writing about this, several people raised questions about, well, what about Hitler? Did Hitler live a meaningful life? And it was a really good, kind of tough question, because on the one hand, it looks like, given my view, you have to be engaged in something objectively worthwhile. The salient things about what Hitler was engaged with was not objectively worthwhile, leaving the answer, no, he did not live a meaningful life because he was engaged in anti-worthwhile things. On the other hand, to say, oh, Hitler's life was meaningless is, I think, counterintuitive. I mean, he made a huge impact on the world. You know, meaninglessness seems to be the wrong thing to say. So my first answer is, look, to talk about meaning, whether Hitler's life is meaningful is already kind of a weird question, except in the context of, let's understand Susan Wolf's views on meaning. I mean, you see Hitler, and what you want to say is he was a moral monster rather than he lived a meaningful, or for that matter, a meaningless life. So that's one thing to say. But, it's I don't actually want to say his life was meaningless, but because he did, I mean, there were some ways in which I guess one has to think he was impressive. He achieved things, and even some aspect of what he was trying to achieve might have been regarded as noble, like give Germany its dignity back or something. Like I'm all for dignity, right? But he was. I mean, the most salient things to say about him really just don't have to do with the meaning of his life. So I think I agree that, that aesthetics and morality can go in different directions. Then you have to make a choice. There's value and meaning in possibly in both directions. Whichever way you choose, there might be meaning, but in some cases, you just want to say, look, morality should trump. And when it comes to the question, how do you live a good life? Then I would say, look, part of living a good life is not just living a meaningful life, but living a life that shows some kind of proportionality about what's important in the world.
Yeah, as musicians, a lot of the time we talk about the virtuoso. Obviously, this word it comes from the words for virtue and this kind of thing. Obviously, in the Renaissance, they had the other concept of virtù, something that is Nietzsche defined that as moral-free virtue, as something that is just proficiency, being able to do something really, really well, he defines that sort of separately from morality. So, but with what you're talking about, it's very important to live a good life, and virtue is also really important. Do you think then for a virtuoso, like to consider the aspects of that being a good person as well, to sort of welcome other people into the experience and not be thinking all about themselves, this kind of thing? What is the role of virtue in the life of a virtuoso? What do you think?
Yeah, good question. Well, I mean, ethically, in terms of ethically, I think just what you said, that being a virtuoso should not lead you to think you're better than other people, or that other people, ought to give you, I mean, you just have to, the equality of other human beings and their values and contributions should, I guess this is just a matter of humility, I suppose. But yeah, the most admirable people will certainly not let even their great skill or talent get in the way of being a good human being, and a socially appreciative human being. As an example, so again, this is just an anecdote. Thinking about meaning and about the fact that I don't want to identify meaning as only about doing what's sort of morally most obviously important and impactful. It's very meaningful to, to save people's lives and, sacrifice a lot of a lot for the good of those needier than yourself and all of that. That's all right. But when it comes to meaningful lives, I look around and there are lots of lives that I think, that is a wonderful life that includes, wonderful meaningfulness. I happen just, kind of serendipitously to, I'm actually giving this interview from Colorado, where I spend a lot of time in the summer and a little bit of time in the winter. And I'm in the place that I stay is very close to Aspen. And Aspen, as you might know, has this wonderful music festival every summer, a music school and music festival. So there's lots of music, and it includes master classes, which are really fun to go to, even if you're not a musician. And one of the best things for my husband and I to do is to go to the Saturday morning opera master classes. It's very popular, and sometimes it's a master class in the dramatic aspects of being an opera performer. A couple times each summer, there's a class on conducting opera. So you've got the orchestra, and I mean they'll do this, one scene at a time, and then there'll be feedback from the master class teacher, and then they'll go back to it. So because I do this stuff a lot, a couple times Jane Glover has been the master class teacher. I don't know if you know anything about her. She's a conductor who's a Mozart specialist. And I can't say anything about how good she is as a conductor. I mean, she must be quite good, because she's, I think she's very distinguished. So all I get is the personality that comes through, the personality and accomplishment that comes through as she's giving these masterclass, advice to the orchestra and to the singers. Anyway, she's a Mozart specialist, and so they'll do a scene from some Mozart opera, and then she'll talk. And it was this combination of incredible knowledge of every detail of the opera from every angle, musical, kind of literary, anyway, she had this amazing knowledge. Her passion and came through unbelievably strong. I mean, she obviously was completely dedicated to this stuff, but she was also witty and kind. The way she talked to the student conductors and the student singers. So there was just this sort of full personality that came through. And again, I can't speak for more than 15 minutes at a time. This was, but I thought, like, that is great. Like, that was, to me, it's one of the models I think of as a meaningful life. It's kind of got everything. It's got passion for something worthwhile, which just coincidentally happens to be a musical passion, combined with these other virtues of wit and empathy and anyway, intelligence, all of this stuff. And I just thought, yeah, that's what, the ideal is to be able to, blend all of these, integrate all of these in a single life.
Yeah, we had a really interesting chat with one of the professors here, Henning Kragert. He's an amazing violinist. And he just a very he lives a very meaningful life. He wrote a blog on this topic as well. How meaningful do you want your life to be? And his way of doing it would be to if he was learning a Mozart concerto, for example, he would fill his mind with as many reasons of love, to sort of quote your book, and Harry Frankfurt, the book that you also quote there, of the music. So things that he'd love, he'd draw on this all the time. And he gave a masterclass here a while ago, and he was able to sort of, for example, I think you mentioned in the discussion about him accompanying the violin with the orchestral part. So he knew all of those parts as well. Just on the violin, he could give advice to the pianist who was playing the parts. Actually, no, it's this, and and so filling our minds with things that we love is the conclusion that he got to. So maybe so to sort of draw these things together, like what to try and define what are we actually basing meaning in life on? Is it love? Is it a life lived out of love for stuff? And what makes something like worthy of love? How, the depth of it, is it something that is deep, or is it something that everyone cares about, or is it something, you see what I mean? What makes a life rich in that love?
Well, I guess so. The question is, it based on love? I mean, love is one of the two components. When I talk about subjective attraction, the rich subjective attraction is love, right? It's to love something. And for meaning, I think I'm talking about something other than self-love. Love, it can be love of another person. It can be love of a piece of music, or a composer, or, the whole realm of music. But it's love of something beyond yourself. That's the sort of, right? And what makes it worthy? Well, right, it may be that some things aren't worthy. Love of, building the tallest toothpick sculpture in the world, is that worthy or not? That's one of the test cases of whether anything that you love can be worthy. And I won't try to answer that question, but at least it's a question one might think could be answered with no. But the question, and what makes something worthy of love, is the same question that we were talking about before. What has objective value? And I can't answer that theoretically. I can only say, well, let's just dig in with one example at a time. Find something to love and ask yourself, does it have objective value? And right, as I say, you just sort of have to get into the weeds with that and try to figure it out.
Yeah. Do you have a question, Abhishek?
Yeah, I think there has been a curious divide between my appreciation of meaning and the way we've been discussing it. Is that because to me, the word meaning has in it of itself a prescriptive value for most people, in that people think that the search for meaning by itself it should be the guiding principle of a whole life in of itself, right? And so people find the search for meaning as a noble pursuit, as a virtuous pursuit. But here we've also spent a while where we have tried to differentiate between morality and meaning, and there are some quite stark differences and examples that find them contradictory as well. So would you say that then the common society's a principle of searching for meaning as a virtue is not something, or the search for meaning, it shouldn't be the most basic virtue for society, because there should be perhaps morality that you should be grounded in before you search for meaning, because your search for meaning could lead you to a very immoral or unethical thing. So, the thing is, here we have just analyzed the meaning of meaning in a certain sense, but for most people it's not just an analytical term, it's a guiding principle. So would you say that does have an inherent flaw within it, and we have to ground ourselves in something else before we look for the meaning in it, rather?
I don't, as you are suggesting, I don't think the search for meaning is the single most important pursuit in a person's life. I think, it's a dimension of the good life, and a person who doesn't give any attention to that dimension, I'm critical of and disappointed in, and sometimes I sometimes I think of all of this in terms of what do you want your children to be? What would you, if you had children, how would you want to raise them? And I would want to I do have children, and the idea that they should find something meaningful in their lives, or many things meaningful in their lives, and they should pay attention to that and care about that, is an important aspect of what I want from them. But it's not the only aspect, and it's not at the top of a hierarchy. I mean, as you also suggest, ethics, being a decent human being, doing your share for your community, having the moral virtues, that is another thing that you want your children to develop into. And then the third, I mean, these are the big three in my little framework, is I also want them to be happy. I want them to, right? I want them to have pleasure and to get pleasure from things. Now, luckily, these things can, and for most people, I think, do tend to be mutually supportive. I mean, you get pleasure out of the things you love, and assuming that the things you love are worth loving, you get meaning from them at the same time, and right. So it's not like usually you don't have to choose, but sometimes you do, and when you have to choose, you need some kind of, you have to just acquire a good judgment, good balance. This is also a very Aristotelian thought. You could be obsessive about doing the morally right thing, but you can be, I mean, it's awful if you don't care about morality at all, or in a minimal way. So yeah, I'm not, but to the question, like, what's the grounding pursuit? I think there are lots of people who will have an answer to that. But that is not the way I think of life. I mean, I think, look, you find yourself in the world. You're thrown into the world, as the existentialist would say. When you're a child, you're not pursuing anything. You're just kind of learning things, exposed to things, developing abilities, developing emotions, right? And so by the time you can even ask questions like, what should I pursue? You're already in media res, right? I mean, there's all kinds of things in your life already. If it goes well, which admittedly it doesn't for everyone, you already love some things, right? You're already interested in some things. My tendency, and this is also connected to, a world with freedom and exposure to things. I mean, part of my parenting philosophy is expose your children to things they might love that are worth loving. And that can go in any direction, to the arts, to athletics, to, intellectual activities, to nature, expose them. They will love something, or many things, and especially, of course, human relationships. And then they can go from there, kind of juggling, their abilities and stuff. So I am not like all right, here's the big question and everything has to fit into it kind of person. It's rather, here we are thrown into the world and finding ourselves with certain drives, personality, urges, and then our job is to reflect on them and balance the different values that we feel we need to balance.
So meaning is an important aspect of living a balanced life, and with balance with the other. But we need to have a
Hi, Susan. So I have sort of a question first, and then some advice to ask for after that question. So you speaking of yourself as a parent and talking about your children makes me think of both my role as an educator. I teach, and also as a student I am taught in the college. Now so far we've been talking about the person who loves, and then the recipient of the love, like the subject that receives the love. I feel like, shouldn't there be like, I'm sure there is like talk, what role does the recipient's interpretation of of receiving that love, what should that play? So from your children's perspective, or from the student's perspective, what role in the meaning making do they play to you? And the advice I'm looking for, I suppose, is this. We at the RNCM, we are blessed with amazing tutors and mentors, and every single one of them love music, love what they do, and strongly believe in sharing that with us. And that is why they're here. And none of them would be teaching us if they didn't strongly believe that their worldviews would help us blossom, and give us a future. In that sense, we get a lot of advice, and sometimes the advice we receive is conflicting, because some will say, this is what you need for a successful career. Some will say, no, this is not what you need. This should be what you're looking for. So we get lots of different advice. And so to them, there's huge inherent value and huge meaning in them doing what they love and expressing their love. And as recipients, I think as part of the meaning making experience, this is the part I'd like your advice on, I suppose, is what do we make of all of this information that we get, or this love that we get, and how do we sort of organize that into something that's meaningful for ourselves?
Right, good. It's hard to answer that question in the abstract. I guess the first thing I want to say is that getting the sometimes conflicting advice or perspective on what's important or good about what you're doing or how you're doing it, I think that's something you should be grateful for, and it's healthy, because it forces you to find your own views. I mean, you can't accept all of it, and you can see that there isn't consensus among wonderful, talented people about this, and so it gives you kind of the impetus, if you didn't have it on your own, to be your own person and make of these different things what you can or will. From the point of view of the teacher, I think the ideal, the virtue of a good teacher is to also be responsive to the responses the teacher gets from their students. So that, for one thing, and I'm guessing at least some of your teachers will agree, we learn from our students. As you say, you teach also. We can learn things from our students just as our students learn from us. I think that's a wonderful experience, actually, to do that. As a teacher, you want to pass on what you know, but you also want your student to develop their own personal views, values, style. It varies with, whether it's music or something else that you're teaching. But you don't want to sort of say, I don't know what different people want different things, but I have been in philosophy departments that have tended to produce, proteges, where, different people, become, they kind of model themselves after their primary teacher. Some professors are like that. They kind of encourage that. They want people to, kind of worship everything they say and sort of develop in their model. Others are not like that at all. They're just as smart and just as interesting, but they don't want proteges. They want, their students to become equals and, and interlocutors and, fellow parties to the debate, if it's a debate, or to the musical, interactions. So I don't know that there's I kind of appreciate the second more than the first. but what, whatever the teacher is, I think you've just got to step back from that, and see, what you think is most valuable and what kind of musician you want to be, and hope that your teachers are able to appreciate your independence, if that's what is involved.
Oh, thank you. Yeah. Do we have any more questions from anyone? I think we sort of maybe it might be nice to sort of draw got someone from someone. Is there such a thing as a good life that is meaningless? Yeah. What would you say?
Well, I think there could be a life that the person or subject who's living it finds good, that I would regard as meaningless. When I talk about the good life, I'm thinking of a life that I could recognize as, something I admire, or could just put it in terms of something I would be happy to have my children live. And so for me, a meaningless life is not a good life for a human being. Humans have the potential for meaning, and therefore, it's a dimension, that I think a life is better if it's meaningful.
Mm-hmm.
But that's not to say it won't be enjoyed by someone that isn't, only if it's meaningful. And I suppose in the other direction, a life can be morally incredibly admirable, and in a certain sense be meaningless to the person who lives it. So that would be very rare, but I can imagine someone who recognizes or feels that there's a duty to devote themselves to something that we also agree is an admirable thing to devote themselves to, but who doesn't love it, right? Who just thinks, I have to do this because that is what the world requires of me, but I don't get any fulfillment from it. Such a life would be meaningless and sad, and not, from the perspective of the person living it, it wouldn't be good. It certainly wouldn't be enviable, but it might be very admirable, and therefore good in a different sense. Like, they gave their whole lives to some cause and made the world a better place, even though they were miserable.
Mm.
I'm not encouraging that.
Yeah. So to sort of draw things to a close, just to sort of sum up what we've learned. So meaning is a crucial importance to living a good life. That it's the life that is without meaning, like Simon was talking about, is something that can't be. It's not tolerable. It's boring. And what would a life without meaning be like? What would it look like? What would we miss?
Well, there are a lot of different ways that you can fall short of meaning. There isn't a single one. When I first started thinking about meaning, long before the book some of you've read, the first piece I wrote was just trying to sort of start with intuitions about what counted as a meaningful life. And the way I thought this through, I said, well, maybe the easier way to start is by thinking of what would count as a meaningless life.
Mm.
And I came up with 3 examples out of which I built the formula that I eventually got to about a meaningful life. So here are my 3 examples, and this is what a meaningless life would look like. Well, 2 examples are what a meaningless life would look like. The third is more controversial. The first I called the blob. This was somebody, and I have to say, this was not this is like There But for Fortune Go I, who kind of sits, in front of the television all day long, drinking beer and watching mindless sitcoms, right? Or or reality TV or something. And the thought was, I mean, it's not a miserable life. It's a very passive life, a life that's passive at a kind of low level of contentment, but where you're not doing anything with it. You're kind of wasting your life by just sitting there all the time. So that's one kind of meaningless life. The second, this is a long time ago I wrote it, so I'm trying to remember the name. It was about someone whose life, I can't remember the label, but in contrast to the blob, whose life was too passive, there was the life who was, it was very active, but active in kind of silly, trivial pursuits. So, or just, pursuits that were not valuable. So, one kind of example would be like the jet setter who, just goes from, fancy restaurant to personal training, working out with her personal trainer to, enjoying all kinds of things. Were very pleasurable, was active, but didn't do anything you could be proud of, didn't, contribute or create anything. I mean, so it's a very different kind of, it could be quite pleasant, actually. A different kind of example, but in the same category, is someone who, well, I gave this example of like the corporate lawyer who works very hard, does, wins all her cases, but her cases are all, just enriching, the Jeff Bezoses of the world, not, again, sort of, so there's a lot of activity, but it's not activity for anything good. Not that, I mean, right. So that's a different kind of meaninglessness. Like a meaningful life is one in which you do something good with your life. And there are two ways you can fail to do something good. One is by not doing anything, being passive like the blob. The other is by doing stuff, but it's none of it is good, morally or otherwise. And then the third case, which was not, this is one that it's controversial, but it's meant to suggest questions about what meaning is a case called bankrupt, where the idea is that you do stuff that that would be good if it succeeded, but it doesn't succeed. So you spend a couple kinds of examples are the scientist who, devotes his career to finding a cure for cancer or whatever, that's the kind of archetypal thing to devote yourself to. And then some other team of researchers find exactly what you were working on before you do, so that your years of work, are all for nothing, in the sense that, you contribute not at all to the actual path of curing cancer. Now, I don't actually think that life is meaningless. And I think there's, if we had more time, we could go on to why. But you can at least imagine how a person who had done this, and then the work comes out from someone else, would feel like, oh my gosh, I've wasted my life, or my life has been much less meaningful than I was hoping it would be. And so you need to find something to say to explain why, if that's a mistaken way to think of your life, where is that mistake? So, but maybe I should leave you with that question, because it's a good question. And we're not going to be able to solve all of the problems of meaning in life today anyways.
Well, thank you so much, Susan. It's been a great conversation, and it's been very interesting to think about the problems with meaning and how it's difficult to ground it in anything that's objective, other than something that we consider to be meaningful, but that it's also really vitally important to have. Otherwise, we can't have a fulfilling life. But and it's also that it's not connected to ethics in a way that would be satisfying, because people live meaningful lives without living ethical lives. So yeah, it's a vitally important thing, especially for us musicians to think about, because we're obviously engaged in things that are very meaningful to lots of people. So it's been amazing to think about this with you, and thank you so much for the conversation.